What if the person who went out of their way to make your life unbearable suddenly found themselves trapped by the consequences of their actions? This story isn't just about getting even. It's about strength, patience, and finding justice in a way no one saw coming. Follow along to see how one man turned relentless harassment into a powerful resolution, creating a ripple effect that changed his community forever. Jacob was a diligent man with a straightforward dream: to own a serene home where he could unwind after years of hard work. After saving up for years and making sacrifices, he finally found the perfect house, a cozy haven in a tranquil neighborhood surrounded by towering trees and friendly faces. Everything seemed perfect, from the neat gardens to the welcoming smiles. But not everyone was happy about Jacob's arrival. His neighbor, Mrs. Thornton, made her displeasure known from the start. From the very first day Jacob moved in, Mrs. Thornton's contempt was unmistakable. What began as icy looks and snide comments quickly escalated into outright hostility. Trash mysteriously appeared on his lawn, baseless complaints were filed against him, and spiteful notes were left on his doorstep. What Mrs. Thornton didn't realize, however, was that Jacob wasn't one to back down. Armed with determination, strategy, and resilience, he carefully turned the situation around in a way no one could have predicted. Jacob believed that persistence and effort always paid off, and buying his dream home was proof of that. He had spent years envisioning the joy of living in a peaceful, neighborly community, and this house represented that dream. It sat on a quiet cul-de-sac with shady streets and friendly neighbors, or so he thought. From the outset, it was clear that Mrs. Thornton wasn't thrilled about his arrival. Known for her controlling nature and tendency to meddle, she had lived in the neighborhood for decades and viewed herself as the unofficial ruler of the block. Her initial hostility was subtle. Disapproving glares as Jacob moved in and remarks like, "Some people just don't belong in places like this." Jacob brushed it off, hoping she would eventually warm up to him. Instead, her behavior took a darker turn. One morning, Jacob found a handwritten note taped to his door. It read, "You don't belong here. Leave." Soon after, bottles, wrappers, and other garbage started showing up on his well-kept lawn. When Jacob installed security cameras, they revealed what he suspected all along. Mrs. Thornton was behind the mess. But she didn't stop there. She began calling the police, accusing Jacob of everything from suspicious behavior to trespassing on his own property. Though the officers saw through her antics, the situation became a constant source of stress for Jacob. Despite the challenges, Jacob remained calm and resolved not to let Mrs. Thornton win. He knew that confronting her directly would only fuel her behavior, as she thrived on conflict. Instead, he started meticulously documenting every incident. He kept the notes, saved video footage from his security cameras, and recorded every false accusation she made to the police. Jacob understood that preparation and evidence were his strongest allies in this battle. One evening, while reviewing his security footage, Jacob noticed an odd pattern in Mrs. Thornton's routine. She left her house every morning and returned hours later carrying stacks of papers. His curiosity was piqued, so he dug into public records to see if he could uncover anything. What he found left him stunned. Mrs. Thornton's home was on the brink of foreclosure. She had fallen behind on her mortgage payments, and the bank had already initiated the repossession process. Jacob saw an opportunity to resolve the situation once and for all. Reaching out to the bank handling her mortgage, he learned that the property would soon go up for sale. Acting swiftly, he used his network in real estate to make a preemptive offer. Within days, his bid was accepted, and he officially became the owner of Mrs. Thornton's home, without her knowledge. For Jacob, this wasn't about getting revenge. It was about regaining his peace and ensuring a better environment for everyone in the neighborhood. Mrs. Thornton had no idea what was coming. The day of reckoning arrived on a sunny afternoon. Jacob was outside trimming his hedges when a sleek black car pulled into Mrs. Thornton's driveway. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, holding a folder of documents. Mrs. Thornton, busy tending her flowers, walked over to the man with a look of irritation. Hands on her hips, she asked, "What's all this about?" The man introduced himself as a representative of the bank and handed her the papers. He calmly explained that the property had been sold. Mrs. Thornton's irritation turned to panic. "What do you mean, sold?" "This is my house," she exclaimed, flipping through the pages in disbelief. Then came the question Jacob had been waiting for. "Who bought it?" The man glanced toward Jacob, who had paused his yard work and was casually leaning against his hedge trimmer. Mrs. Thornton's eyes followed and locked onto Jacob's. Her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She stormed over, her voice trembling with fury. "How could you do this? You think you could just take my house?" Jacob remained calm, his tone measured. "I didn't take anything from you," he replied. "You made your choices, and I made mine." The neighbors, many of whom had endured Mrs. Thornton's domineering behavior for years, peeked out from their windows, silently cheering. For Jacob, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about creating boundaries and taking back control of his life. Mrs. Thornton had spent months making his life difficult, but the tables had turned. With her reign over the neighborhood effectively ended, Jacob quietly returned to his hedges, leaving her to face the reality of her actions. With Mrs. Thornton gone, relief swept through the neighborhood. For years, her domineering presence had cast a shadow over the community. Many residents had avoided her sharp remarks and cold glares, preferring to stay out of her way. Now, with her house empty and her influence gone, the neighborhood began to change in ways Jacob hadn't expected. Just days after her departure, neighbors who had once kept to themselves started introducing themselves to Jacob. An older man shared how Mrs. Thornton had scolded his grandchildren for playing on the sidewalk, while a young couple admitted they considered moving because of her constant complaints about their garden. Inspired by their stories, Jacob decided to help rebuild the neighborhood's sense of community. He organized a meeting at the local recreation center, inviting everyone to share their ideas. To his surprise, almost every household attended. That meeting sparked a series of collaborative efforts, including transforming an overgrown lot into a vibrant community garden. Families worked together, planting flowers, vegetables, and fruit trees, creating a shared space everyone could enjoy. Block parties soon became regular events, filling the neighborhood with music, laughter, and delicious food. Jacob also helped start a neighborhood watch, strengthening trust and security. Slowly, the isolation and fear Mrs. Thornton had created gave way to connection and unity. Her departure wasn't just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a brighter, more connected community. Jacob's quiet determination not only transformed his own life, but also inspired those around him. Neighbors shared stories of their renewed sense of belonging, and soon word of his efforts spread beyond their little street. Local news outlets featured his story under headlines like, "Man turns conflict into community, a neighborhood transformed." One neighbor summed it up perfectly. "Jacob showed us you don't need to fight back loudly. Sometimes, patience and smart decisions are enough." Jacob was later invited to share his approach at community events, where he emphasized using calm, strategic methods to address conflict. His story resonated, inspiring other neighborhoods to adopt his ideas. Community gardens, block parties, and neighborhood watch programs modeled after Jacob's initiatives began popping up across the city. Although he never sought recognition, Jacob's actions left a lasting legacy. His journey proved that adversity can be a powerful catalyst for positive change. By staying composed, thinking strategically, and fostering unity, Jacob transformed a toxic situation into a thriving community. As Jacob often said, "You don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the best way forward is to let it burn out and focus on building something better." If Jacob's story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting stories, and stay tuned for our next feature.